Hello, welcome. Nice to have you guys. All right. So what we are working on here is the progressive movement and the 1920s. All right, I want to make sure that you guys are prepared for everything that's due up to next week, next um, Tuesday. All right. So let me get your names down so that you receive your well-earned extra credit. Thank you for your patience with the grades. All right. I was observed and I threw everything into that. It was just a couple days ago. So that is done and I'm out of excuses. All right. So let's see here. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump right into it if that's okay, with the progressive movement. Are you guys okay? Is anything you'd like to communicate to me before I start? All right, well, at any given time, feel free to unmute yourself, okay? And share anything with me. So remember with the progressive movement, right? The progressive movement was ostensibly meant to defeat the problems, the injustices, the imbalances of the Industrial Revolution. Oftentimes they use a term called casualties of progress, and there were casualties of progress, right? You look at skilled workers, cobblers who made shoes, tailors who made clothing. They can't compete with mass production. They just can't. So they're known as artisans, and artisans arguably were a casualty of this. And then also, right, people contend that some people were kind of pigeonholed into the proletariat, into the manual laboring class of the industrial era, and they couldn't get out. They didn't make enough money. They didn't have enough opportunities to rise within their own structure, like to become foremen and supervisors and white collar clerks. But they were kind of stuck where they were with their meager pay, and that includes the Latino demographic, right? Chicano historians oftentimes will use that term in their chapters, proletarianization. Okay, not to mention, right? They didn't like to stop production for anything, even if it were for safety standards. And so we were number one, says Howard Zinn, in the industrial world for accidents and injuries at the workplace as well. The gap between the rich and the poor became almost ridiculous. As I have here, the wealthiest 1% of families in 1890 owned 51% of the real and personal property, owned over half, just the top 1%. All right. So then there was a problem, right? There was a perceived problem that the people in the proletariat, the people that perhaps even worse than the proletariat, the people that they would call marginalized, who were kind of kicked to the corner and weren't kind of integrated into the capitalist economy and system, that they had destructive behavior. That for one, right, people that are miserable sometimes seek escape. So you have issues with perhaps alcohol, drugs, prostitution, etc. And they kind of have a culture of despair. All right. Then you also, and then that despair can lead to criminal activity. Then you also have the development of more radical labor unions, right? That perhaps would not have come into being, and this is argumentative, had things not been so lopsidedly inequitable, unfair, right? And so you have, for instance, the industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies, the IWW. You have the Communist Party. You had the syndicalists. You had the anarchists, and others, right? Who wanted to. It wasn't so much their sense of like a perfect society one day, right? They call that a utopia. They had like utopian visions, and I don't know if there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it was how they planned to get to that utopian vision that was scary, because oftentimes they were for violently assassinating some of their bosses at work, blowing up machines, and going to great kind of destructive lengths to stop production, to kind of get them on their heels. And then, of course, violently overthrowing the government to get to a different economic state. And so that's what was so scary to the people of that generation, all right, of like the 1890s and the first decade or so of the 1900s. So remember, we're coming to the end of what they call the Gilded Age, the age that looked glittery and nice on the outside, but you scratch the surface and it's corrupt and corroded and ugly, and which is arguably from 1870 to 1900. And now you're getting in the beginning in the 1890s, the beginnings of the progressive era, right? Of these progressives who want to do something about it. Okay. And recall that the progressives, they had a few main avenues of trying to solve these problems. One was trying to give hope and help to the marginalized and those who were stuck in the proletariat. So remember, you have in this one the settlement houses, right? Jane Addams, Lillian Wald. They would come into an immigrant enclave. Remember, an enclave is like a Chinatown, like a nationally or ethnically homogenous, all of the same background from the same home country. And oftentimes they were very poor, and yes, you had high crime rates, etc. Again, that kind of cultural despair. And they'd go into the area and they would offer night classes to the adults. They'd offer day classes to the kids. They'd offer babysitting. They tried to keep the kids out of trouble and off the streets with recreational sports. They made deals with the local jails to get the youth out of the jails and have a separate juvenile system. So yeah, the progressives were kind of responsible for that. They taught job skills to the adults. They had connections with employment agencies to actually get them jobs. They helped fight for their access to water, electricity, and garbage disposal. And of course, they also fought for their opportunity to have housing and building codes that were safe and sanitary, etc. So then, in addition to trying to help those, give hope to those who were at the bottom, they also wanted to have accountability for those at the top. And so they were for bigger government, to be more regulatory over big business and corporations, right? So they wanted an actual antitrust act that worked, that would be employed, that would be used and break up trusts. Remember with trusts, right? Is oftentimes like you see in Rockefeller, what he would do is he'd say, okay, he'd tell the middlemen, like railroad guys, all right, if I offer you 6 tons of oil a day, what are you going to offer me in return? Because you could charge me per pound and I'm going to make you a fortune. And they said, well, even you can't afford, even you don't even develop 6 tons a day. And he said, you let me worry about that part of it. But if I do, what should you give me? They said, heck, we'll give you a 45% discount. And he's like, now we're talking. So it ended up going as high as 65% discount per pound. So what he does is he joins up with other oil tycoons and they join their oil up to provide 6 tons a day. And then they separate it at the refineries. And so that'd be an example of trust activity, right? Of them, big businesses teaming up. They'd also, right? They'd cut deals with each other. They'd say, okay, hey, you're the Home Depot and I'm the Lowe's, and we're charging, we're getting down to $4 a hammer, which is ridiculously low, competing with each other. How about we both put it down to $2 a hammer, because the small businesses, the mom and pops, they can't afford to sell a hammer for only $2. They will literally go out of business if that lasts for long. And that's exactly what we intend. So let's put our price for a hammer down to $2 until the small businesses go under. Then we'll make an agreement with each other to put it up to $12 and agree not to undercut each other and both keep it equally at $12. And people have to pay that high price when the mom and pops are out of the equation. So those are some examples of trust activity, right? and there was no law against it. But yet they knew, I think they knew deep down morally, ethically, that something was not right about that it was not fair. For instance, with Rockefeller, right? He would never put it on pen. He would never sign it when he made those agreements with other big businesses. He said, my handshake will suffice. So at any rate, they the progressives, they wanted an actual something better than the Sherman Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 just said any illegal conspiracies in restraint of trade and competition are illegal, and nothing was done about it. It was vague, it wasn't enforced, etc. So then, when Woodrow Wilson became president, he was the second president to claim that he was a progressive after Teddy Roosevelt, and he contended, all right, we're going to make an actual list. And if it's on this list of your activity, then it technically we can get you for trust-like behavior. So it somewhat worked. And then what do you know? They started taking more people to court over the antitrust law. They also, right, the middlemen, giving opportunities to the big corporations who offered them more in weight and tonnage to have these rebates. And then the small guys, they'd stick it to them and give whatever high price they wanted because they knew they had them, right? And so they began to actually enforce the Interstate Commerce Act, the Interstate Trade Act, whereby prices, people for storage companies and railroads had to be the same for everybody. They had to be reasonable and just. And they actually created an Interstate Commerce Commission that put price ceilings and said exactly how high they could charge per pound and no higher than that. Okay. So now they're starting to actually enforce this stuff. And so, so the progressives were very much for limiting the power of big business. They were with the people and fomenting the sense that the big businesses were to blame for everything, for all their major problems, at least economic ones. And they were popular for doing it. It was a kind of a popular cause to jump onto. And so hence Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had a lot of success claiming that they were progressives running as president. So at any rate, in addition to that, right, they wanted, because they were kind of almost like modern deists, believing that everything works by a certain type of science. There's a science to everything, they thought. And so therefore, right, they wanted people who were educated in college who knew that particular science. So, right, politicians should be well-versed in political science. The people that run their budget and run their treasury, etc., at any given governmental level, were to be adept in macroeconomics. Okay. And so they wanted expert rule over a lot of things. And with that expert rule, right, they had a side to them that was very kind of paternalistic, like trust us, population. We're the experts. We're the educated ones. We know the science to everything. We'll be fair for you, unlike big business. And, trust the power with us. So that was kind of a more of an etchy, questionable side to the progressive movement to this very day. The fact that they tended to somewhat favor rule by experts over popular rule, over democratic rule. Okay. So at any rate, moving on to the next subject. Okay. Everything they did for the immigrant groups was oftentimes very paternalistic, at least in their rhetoric and what they claimed they stood for, right? And so with the Mexican Americans, it shouldn't surprise you that it was no different. So look at Simon Lubin in California. He says he planned a reciprocal, right? That's mutual relationship with the Mexican immigrants in which they were to receive physical aid and be taught the English language, while Los Angeles authorities and people were to derive benefits from their, quote, immigrant gifts. Now, what exactly does that mean? It's hard to infer. That's pretty vague. But notice, right, he claims in his rhetoric that it's to be a two-way relationship, okay? But I say here that, however, from the source I was using, it didn't happen that way. It was a one-way street. The Californian authorities and the progressive leaders of California kind of became beyond paternalistic with the Mexican Americans and just made the demand that they assimilate. So look at this one. Look at this this quote here. Our task is to break up these groups or settlements, to assimilate, right? And that is to drop your own culture, your own practices and values, and to embrace those of your host country and amalgamate, right? Become one, these people as part of our American race. Race, okay? We don't really use that term anymore. So notice it's not American nationality, because the United States is an artificial entity, right? It's a modern nation state of people from a myriad of different ethnic backgrounds. But now they're talking as if there is an American race, ethnically, and to implant in their children, so far as can be done, the Anglo-Saxon conception of righteousness, law and order, and popular government. Wow. Okay. All right. And so Anglo-Saxon, the Angles and the Saxons were the groups that took over England when it fell as Britannia, as Roman England. And they were Germanic, they were light-skinned. They claimed that they had a very decentralized, anti-big government way of forming government. So for instance, they had the hundreds, the different we've gone over this in the past, the different councils and juries and court systems that were based upon the will of 100 people in a given village. So they claim they have this libertarian tradition that's anti-tyranny, etc., and liberty-loving. Yeah, that's very, very biased, to say the least. It's very ethnocentric, putting your ethnicity, your culture and worldview as the center of the universe and the measuring stick that ought to be used in measuring anyone or anything. So at any rate, look at this. In 1915, the Home Teacher Act required teachers to work in the homes of their pupils, instructing children and adults. Could you even imagine that right now? A teacher coming into a home to teach the kids and to teach the parents and to try to have them become a little less Latino and more Anglo-Saxon? Like, wow. Okay. So leading intellectuals like Dr. Emory Bogardus of USC emphasized tactically assimilating the mothers, as they were the key to socializing their children, teaching right from wrong to their children. All right. And the children were the second generation who didn't have old national habits to break. So start them when they're young. Okay. So how did it go in this kind of ethnocentric direction, right? In forcing and trying to force the Mexican Americans of Los Angeles during the Progressive Era to assimilate to allegedly Anglo-Saxon ways. Well, for one, you had the revolution in Mexico of 1910. Porfirio Diaz had ruled since 1876, and he did rule with a bit of an iron hand. He also was seen a little bit as a sellout, a vendido, because most of the big businesses that did so well in his industrial development of his country were foreign-based, German, English, American. And yeah, he wasn't much for the autonomy of the local regions and states, and he wasn't much for the rights of the individuals. So finally, he's chased out in 1910, and it starts a rat race, right? So you have Emiliano Zapata down in the South, and he wants the land to be redistributed back to the peasant indigenous Mexicans, okay? And he wants them to have local autonomy, democratic rule, etc. And that is Emiliano Zapata. Then in the North, you had Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa, well, he just went back and forth as far as what he really stood for. But one thing was evident, right? That in the sense of class consciousness, of being aware of the fact that there was a rich versus a poor, and he was on the side of the poor, he made that amply clear. Legend states, right, that he started off killing his hacendado, the hacienda owner for whom he labored and his family labored for violating his sister. And so at any rate, he had a very anti-hacendado stance, but he just wasn't as ideological as Emiliano Zapata was. And then in the north, however, you had Carranza, Venustiano Carranza. And Carranza was an hacendado himself. And he clearly was conservative. And he somehow got Pancho Villa to work for him until they had a split. And they fight each other, and Carranza is going to defeat Pancho Villa. And so Carranza is going to end up becoming president, but not before a couple dramatic rises and falls occur at the presidential level in Mexico City. All right. But one way or another, while all this is going on, they say over 1 million Mexican people immigrated to the US. And so Americans, right, were afraid of race suicide. Okay. To be honest, as much as I just subjectively like Teddy Roosevelt, but he had a racist side that I have nothing I could say in defense of him. And I just kind of shake my head and say that stinks because I want to like this guy. But at any rate, he advocated this too, this concern is that they said that the Anglo-Saxon people, especially being better educated, they oftentimes, it became more of like a middle-class thing, right? And we're going to see that with the 20s assignment, is that you live for yourself and your career in middle-class culture. And children are not a high priority in that value system. And so oftentimes you wait until at least your 30s to get married. And then you ponder the possibility with the access of birth control if you want to have any children or not. Whereas the poor, right, they are marrying and they're having children at a very young age. And so hence the poor, right, and not just the poor, but the ethnic minorities, the ethnic immigrants, right, are reproducing at a much higher rate, and they're going to outproduce us. And we are basically, as Anglo-Saxon white people, I'm saying this on behalf of them, not myself, are committing race suicide by not competing in biological production with these groups. And then remember also at this time, and I have it mentioned in that last assignment of the progressives in general, is the immigrants, they generically called them new immigrants because they were far from Anglo-Saxon. They were far from being Western European, as so many American migrants had been, arguably, in the past, and at least in the positions of power over the colonies and over the states when we became independent from Britain. And so you have people from Eastern Europe in large numbers. So Ukraine, Russia, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, etc. You have people from Southern Europe, Greece, and the Balkans, right, that had Serbians and Croatians and Albanians. You had people coming from Syria and Lebanon and Israel and Palestine in large numbers. You had people coming from Sicily and southern Italy, etc. So these people, right, they're not WASP. They're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians at all. And so hence they gave them the generic term new immigrants. And people are worried about that they're coming in such large numbers and they're doing, they're having so many children. All right, so look at this. They were afraid that they were going to reimpose the Mexican flag over the California state. And then if that's not bad enough, right, then you had the Flores Magón brothers, and you had La Mujer Mexicana y la Pluma Roja, the Mexican woman and the red pen. And the red pen, right, there's a reason for putting Roja on there. Red already symbolized the Bolsheviks of Russia and communism. Okay. And the Flores Magón brothers, they wanted an anarchist revolution. And again, if you're an anarchist and you have kind of like this John Lennon Imagine song, vision that everyone just shares everything and there's no need for government, there's nothing inherently dangerous about that. But the way to get there for the anarchist was through violence, was to violently throw down the government, okay, rather than to do it incrementally by legislation. And so hence, right, these were seen as radical groups, and they're connected to Mexican leaders. And it scared the heck out of the population of California, etc. And then in addition to that, you had what they will call the Red Scare. But actually, before I get to the Red Scare, notice this one here is we had a drama with the Mexican government, and that always socially pops up when people are aware, right, that we sent Marines and soldiers into Mexico to fight the Mexican Authority, the Mexican people, not on one, but on two different occasions under Woodrow Wilson in the 19 teens. That's going to affect the social arena, right? Of how Anglos and Latinos are going to get along in Los Angeles and these other areas of California. So the first one was Huerta. Francisco Madero, President Wilson was called the pistol packing preacher in Mexico. And because it was like he preached and on what was proper liberal representative government. And if you didn't follow that, he would try to mandate that you do, even though you're a separate sovereign country from him and his country. And so he liked Madero. Madero had liberal credentials. He wanted elective leaders. He wanted a federal constitutional Republican government like ours. And so he was right up Wilson's alley. But his leader of the military initiates a coup and overthrows him, arrests him, claims that he tried to escape and has him shot and killed, executes him. And Wilson was furious. So Wilson calls Victoriano Huerta a butcher, and he will not recognize his neighbor's president in the form of a butcher. And so there was an incident in Tampico whereby American Navy sailors came in because they were having issues with their frigate, their ship, and they were arrested. A handful of them were tortured, yeah. And then not only that, Huerta refused to pay off foreign debts. So put those two together, and Wilson decided to go and invade Veracruz, take over their customs houses where they collected taxes, import and export taxes, to forcefully take the money that was owed American banks and bankers, and to also teach a lesson to Huerta for what he had done. And then the second incident was Villa. Villa was getting arms from Wilson, and Wilson became convinced that Villa was not ideologically inclined enough, as Zapata was down in the South, and that he was a losing horse to bet on, that Carranza just had too many resources, too much money as an hacendado. So he revoked the ammunition and the guns shipments to Pancho Villa, and he lost shortly after that a pivotal battle to Carranza, and he blamed the Americans for doing that, for his loss. And so he supposedly wanted to fight U.S. soldiers. He invaded the border into Columbus, New Mexico, and he headed straight for the military fort. But Americans came out of their houses when they see this marauding army of men on horses that are armed, and fired at them. And of course, he fired back, and he ended up killing 21 American civilians on American soil. And so we sent Marines under Pershing through northern Mexico trying to find Pancho Villa. And of course, we never did. He will be killed by men under Obregon in the early 20s down in Mexico. So at any rate, then there was the great Red Scare. We had, like I said, the Wobblies, the IWW. They began sabotaging their war factories. Okay. They began assassination attempts and assassinations. There was a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and he was kind of like the predecessor to J. Edgar Hoover, like an early form of our FBI. And his house was bombed. And so then the Supreme Court gave a virtual green light to the federal government, to the executive, to go after these red commies, these radicals who were sabotaging our war effort in World War I. So remember, World War I, we eventually got involved because of international violations of our neutral rights as a neutral country, namely by Germany. Germany was using their U-boats, their submarines, to sink our ships and to sink international cruisers and so forth that had American travelers on them. And they promised at one point, they made a promise to stop, and then they revoked that promise toward the end of the war and reinstituted unrestricted submarine warfare. And that's when we asked to join the war against Germany, against the Ottoman Empire, against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay. And to Wilson, right, it was vital that we win this war because those countries that I just mentioned, he said, were anything but democratic. They were backward, according to his WHIG, his liberal English Whig principles. Because you look at representative government, you look at checks and balances, and they didn't fare well. The Ottoman Empire still had a sultan, right? That ruled by Sharia law with the Quran in Turkey. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, just Google pictures of them. Just a landed aristocracy of Magyar, which are, I guess, Hungarian, and Austrian dukes and earls, etc., and no representation in a parliament. Much less control over the emperor. They still had an emperor. And then Germany, right? They went through the motions. They had a republic on paper. They had the Reichstag, the German parliament. But the lower class was always outvoted and dominated by the upper branch that was run by the Junkers, spelled like Junkers, the German aristocracy. And then you also had a prime minister who could be who was chosen, and it could be revoked by an emperor, the Kaiser. And so they really weren't very successful in living up to Whig standards. So to Wilson, right, it was imperative that the side of England and France and the United States win because they were much more democratic. They were much more modern and progressive. And so the world needed the good guys to win. So it was all the more of a threat when these radicals rose up throughout the country during World War I to sabotage our war effort. What he concluded, right, was that it's better to become somewhat tyrannical for a moment during war when it's needed to make sure that the enemies of the state are squashed. And then when we win the war, then everything is safe to go back into its democratic pattern. And some people might say that that's a scary way of thinking, but that's at least the way Wilson articulated his plan. So they cut short our First Amendment with the not necessary property, the clear and present danger clause. So this is the reason to this day that you can't yell bomb on an airplane, etc. If you express yourself in a way that creates an environment of clear and present danger, you can't express yourself in that manner. And so they really kind of stomped down for him being such a quote self-pronounced liberal president and progressive. He really squashed down on who he saw as radical enemies to the state. So it got us in that type of national mood, if you will. And so then, right, that's one. These are some of the reasons why we turned on the threat of having so many Mexicans in Southern California. And of course, I'm not rationalizing that. I'm trying to explain it. There's all the difference in the world between explaining something and justifying it. Okay, so that's his paradoxical belief that I just stated. Right. And then agency, lastly. The Latinos didn't just take this abuse laying down. 1911 in Texas, Nicasio Hidar led a grassroots political organization, El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, right? The first Mexican Congress, aimed not only against discrimination and lynching, but also programs intended to eradicate Mexican American culture. In 1915, La Liga was established first in Phoenix, which provided night classes to Mexican people, helped them secure employment, supported strikes, lobbied legislators for their children's access to bilingual education, and so forth. All right. So the Mexican Americans, they fought back legally, okay, against this discrimination and this insistence that they assimilate and kill their own culture by choice. All right. So anyway, that's it for this one. All right, if you don't mind. So if there aren't any other questions, I'll try to be a little quicker on this next one. But the next one, right, is the Roaring Twenties. What I'm saying in a nutshell on this one, okay, is that there were situations that Mexican Americans found themselves in that made it very difficult to get their family members up here. I want to go straight to it. Let's see here. Let's see here. Pardon me. Right here. That in some cases, right, they intended their in the 1920s, Latinos intended, Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants intended to have a circular pattern of immigration. They come in for a while, they make enough money, and then they send it back as a remittance, as it's called, or they travel back themselves to Mexico and either stay there and provide that money to the people of their family and village, or they come back with the money to bring more family members with them back into the United States. All right. So a lot of them, when they came here in the 1920s, they had a hard time because they were making more money than they did in Mexico. There are plenty of sources that seem to indicate that. Okay. So it was a lesser evil coming here to the US, making more money than you could oftentimes in Mexico proper. All right. But it was not enough money. And also, like I said here, inflexible demands from their employers. They're working so many hours a week that they didn't have enough money oftentimes to accumulate enough money to bring the rest of their family up here. Okay. And they didn't have enough time from their work schedule to return back to Mexico. So hence, right, during the 1920s, just those facts alone demonstrate that the migration to America could have a somewhat of a disintegrating effect on the Mexican family. Some just seem to have been just kind of caught up here economically. Okay. But if that's not enough, right, then there is the issue of volition, of choice, right? And look here, you know, in the roaring 20s, you have average salaries. And by the way, in many industries, the per capita income went up as high as 38%. 38%. But overall, you see it here at the bottom, per capita income had increased from the average person. Remember that's including the homeless and those who aren't working. 522 a year to 716 a year between 21 and 29. So hence they call this the roaring 20s, right? And it starts with the economy. The economy took off. And yes, a lot of people believe a lot of it was artificial because a lot of it was based upon credit, money owed to others. But nevertheless, right, during that time, a lot of Americans got to live it up. F. Scott Fitzgerald said it was the greatest, gaudiest spree in history. Right? And remember, he's the one who wrote about the modern woman and the youth culture in the Great Gatsby book. Automobile construction rose 225% as car ownership more than doubled. Cities with 250,000 or more inhabitants grew by 8 million, and suburban growth coincided with an increase in home ownership. All right. In 1928, American homes contained 15 million irons, 6.8 million vacuum cleaners, 5 million washers, 4.5 million toasters, and 750,000 electric refrigerators. This is all possible not only by a rising per capita income, but also by purchase on credit. Right? Enjoy now, pay later. And then as you're familiar with, right, they utilize that kind of instant gratification culture with the stock market. It was called buying on margin. You would borrow the money to buy a certain number of stocks, and the stocks and a lot of the main, automobile, electricity, plastic, and these other industries, they were money. Like you just knew they were going to continue through increase in sales to increase in value stock. And so as the stock grew from what you allegedly purchased it at on credit, you just subtracted from your profits when you sold it what you had initially borrowed. And that's great, and it works as long as the value of your stock goes up. But of course, what happens when it goes down? And, you haven't paid even your initial dividend. So that happens with the Great Depression, 29. But at any rate, for now, right, it's a great spree. Then in addition to that, you have the development of the new woman, as seen through the image of the flapper and the flapper attire, right, by Coco Chanel. You have Hollywood come of age. You have the radio just explode. You have advertisement come of age. For young women, college education tripled during the 1920s. Tripled. It's amazing. So now a lot of kids, right, with the automobile, with jobs, with college, they have now this more modern sense of adolescence that we take for granted today. Because you go back to the colonial time periods, right? And it was like you go from childhood to adulthood when it comes to your responsibilities in life. But now during the 20s, it's the beginning of this kind of limbo stage, right? Whereby young men and women can sow their wild oats, can enjoy themselves, can gratify themselves for the time being until they hunker down with adult-like responsibilities. So hence develops, right, a youth culture. And I wish I were more adept at sociology, right? Because when they get into your key socializers, oftentimes different sociologists would say that up to a certain age, it is definitely your guardians. But when you get to the age of adolescence, it arguably could become your peers, even more than your guardians, as those who try to directly and indirectly influence how you perceive the world, what you consider right and wrong, how you behave, etc. So you have the development, right, of a youth culture. You have economic abundance that transpires. You have the development of all of these new temptations in the form of consumerism and recreation. So you have not only the automobile, like I said, you have the radio, you have dance halls now are playing the new jazz music. The Cotton Club, right, was the most popular one. You have sports and stadiums sprout up at this time, and boxing arenas, etc. All kinds of temptations are arising. And then you have all these strip malls and shopping malls, etc., that have all this nice, sharp new clothing and so forth, right? That really shows off what you could enjoy at the moment. And then, of course, right, they said that advertising came of age with its manipulative powers of psychology, right? Like a famous ploy they would use is that if you don't look your best, you're going to run across the woman or the man of your dreams publicly, and you're not going to be prepared looking your best, and that person's going to overlook you, and you're going to miss the love of your life, etc. Okay. So at any rate, you have that. Then you also had the fact that in 1925, it was, what was it? 5 million movie tickets were bought. All right. The Harlem Renaissance. Sadly, you have the juxtaposition of racism that is still alive and well, with people desiring to go, quote, slum it in Harlem, enjoy themselves, kind of like Vegas, and forget it ever happened once they left. And then to whatever extent that it was immoral, they would attribute it to the Black culture and the Black people, that's how they are. And this was just an anomaly, an out of the ordinary exception for me. And of course, a great example of that is right here, Baker, Josephine Baker, this Black woman. Americans wanted her to be a sex symbol, and then they treated her terribly everywhere she went to go and perform. They wouldn't allow her into restaurants and hotels, etc. But boy, they'd buy her tickets and cheer her on. And when you Google her, right, be prepared to see some kind of risque clothing, just putting her name in on Google, because they wanted her that way as a sex symbol. All right. They did a sociological experiment in Muncie, Indiana, and they found that a lot of the young women had not kept their virginity to marriage. And notice, right, they focus on the women because this is the end of the Victorian era, and it was the Victorian era was an era of sexual double standards. Men are pigs, that's just the way they are, but women are supposed to be, right, like not even hardly enjoy intimacy and so forth, that they're much more virtuous than men, and supposed to demonstrate that. And so with men and young women are doing the same thing. They're letting go of their inhibitions at this time, etc. The fact that women were doing it was a much bigger deal to the public, to that generation. All right, this quote new woman. You see it in Hollywood with Clara Bow and Louise Brooks on the movie screen. Let's see here. And then the defiance of prohibition, the 18th Amendment. It was anything that was like 0.05% alcohol Like it even took cough medicine off the shelves. And then there's so much evidence of defiance of it, right? It's just it's overwhelming, the evidence, right? They think that for every illegal distillery that was shut down, that was illegally making alcohol, that 9 others were getting away with it. Members of the National Guard with the Canadian border, 1 out of 10 was caught and removed for taking bribes and being complicit in the illegal transportation of illegal alcohol. And of course, Al Capone. Al Capone flaunted his wealth. Everybody knew how he got it. He killed a guy named Lonergan in a public nightclub. He killed another guy who was vocalized being happy about the death of Al Capone's brother in broad daylight, like at a coffee shop. Killed the guy, and no one would take the stand against him. And most infamously, right, arguably was the Valentine's Day massacre. So a lot of people say that this was a generation of youth culture, and it was a generation of deviance. And what I mean by deviance, I mean it in the sociological term. I don't mean by someone who has like a very bizarre vice. With deviance, right, is just that which you were taught by your guardians when you were young, as far as right and wrong, proper and improper behavior, you deliberately deviated from that. Okay. And then it was demonstrated from the very top down. Warren G. Harding had affairs on his wife that were publicized. The Teapot Dome scandal. He put his buddies in his cabinet, and they took oil that belonged to the Navy and switched it over to the Interior Department, and the Interior Department sold it to a buddy who owned an oil company, and they all shared the buddy's oil company's profits. And then they had a regular place on Pennsylvania Avenue whereby they would take bribes people against prohibition, that were violating prohibition. All right. So anyway, it's one thing for Mexican Americans to get caught here, right, with their jobs not quite making enough to make it back to Mexico, or to send a remittance, a gift of money back to loved ones that was enough for them to come up. But then you also had, right, the temptations of this new country. So for instance, Rahel Galoob, right? She was a Jewish girl from Russia. And I might be taking a stretch here, okay? But I know that I've read this in Mexican American books. I know what happened. And so I'm just running with it, okay? If you'll indulge me, I don't have any stats to prove it. But Rahel Galoob, right? She contended that as an immigrant, she and her father came here from Russia, and she worked as a young lady in a factory. And the other young ladies would buy these nice dresses. They would go out at night and meet boys and have fun and listen to jazz music, etc. Right? And she would kind of mention it to her dad as a hint, right? Like, maybe I'd like to have a little bit of fun. I'd like to do something like that with some of my money, because all of her money, 100% of it, she literally put on the kitchen table for her dad, because she had a sister and mom that were still stuck in Russia. And so that was the culture, right? Was the family first. You were just one cog in the wheel. You were just one person. How dare you be selfish and think about your own desires and this and that, okay? Then in addition to that, she met some of the workers under Lillian Wald in her Cherry Street settlement house. And they were telling Rahel that she was intelligent and that she could get an education and that she could make something of herself and have a nice career. Well, on 2 different occasions, she asked her dad, and one, "Do you think I could save a little bit of my salary, Dad?" and buy myself something nice. And he was literally, she said, disgusted by that question. How dare you put yourself above your sister and your mom who are still back in Russia? All right. And then also, right, when he found that she had a Bible, because they were Jewish, right, only believing in the Old Testament, under Judaism, right, they're still waiting on a Messiah. They didn't believe Jesus was it. And so she brought a full Bible with a New Testament and claiming Jesus is the Messiah home, and her dad just flipped a switch. She got it from the settlement house workers. So her diary became a book, well-read one, about the dilemmas that were faced by immigrants, having an old school way of living and looking at the world and value system, and then these new circumstances in this new country, these new temptations, etc. This generational rift that happens. Because for whatever reason, right, I don't know if you could just simply say that people get stuck in their ways, but the immigrants who were at least middle age when they came here did not statistically show much of a sign of assimilating to American culture. It was the young who did, either those who were born here and by virtue of the 14th Amendment would be considered Mexican-American citizens, or those who were quite young, adolescents or younger when their family moved here, who took more of an interest in things American. So I said Rahel Galoob is kind of an example of what happened with young Mexican Americans here, young Mexican immigrants. All right. So youth culture. And youth culture, by the way, was very kind of anti-God in the 1920s. Postmodernism said there's no such thing as objective truth. God was a construct of man by Nietzsche, etc. For those kids that were getting an education. And the Mexican people culturally were very faithfully Catholic. So a lot of them moved to LA, Denver, El Paso, and San Antonio. Okay. They're facing these temptations. And look at this, is a lot of them, when they came here, began to elope. And look at what their tradition said. Let's see here. Not only did Mexican Americans more often marry according to personal choice and love, they also tended to defy traditional norms concerning the phases of courtship and marriage. Tradition had mandated the young woman's parents' official permission for courtship, just to date her. The man of your house, young men, was supposed to ask the man of the young girl's house permission to date her. Then you had chaperones for your dates, right? Then you had an official request for the bride-to-be's hand in marriage from her parents, right? The petition for the hand of the hand. A groom-to-be's gift of money for wedding expenses. Then an official notice to the Catholic clergy. Then both of you were to go to reconciliation and go to Mass and partake of the Eucharist separately. And then you had an all-night reception for both families. That was tradition. All right. And that oftentimes, from the very first generation here of youth, was broken. There's a lot of evidence of people just running away and marrying. And look at this. The Spanish called elopement, robo, from the word robar, to rob, to steal the woman. And then look at this, hacer las paces, right? Then your dad or older brother was to go, in the cases of elopement, go and formally provide dinner for and ask the pardon of your younger brother or your son for eloping with his daughter, and asking if he could help. And of course, what I didn't put in here, and I should have, was also working through the Catholic Church and a priest to make this right after the fact and get the father's permission and to have them have a ceremony with a priest in a Catholic church. So it happens so often, right? People doing this after the fact, after they had violated Mexican tradition, that it developed a name, right? The making of peace. We also know, unfortunately, that as the Mexican fathers began to lose a lot of control in America over their daughters and over their wives who had to go and work, that that led to some domestic problems. That feeling of powerlessness generated anger, feeling of impotence, and so you have a rise of alcoholism, unfortunately, and domestic abuse. So hence, right, moving here and materially perhaps improving in Gringo land during the 1920s had a cost. It came at a cost. All right. Any questions or comments? You guys, any of you find any of this interesting? And no, I'm not talking about how I put anything together or how I wrote it. I'm talking about the material itself from the textbooks. Thank you, Xavier. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating. I know I myself, with like a couple of my Latino friends growing up, um, their parents, and I was trying to gain a grasp of their language from a young age, and their parents would speak to them in Spanish when I'd come into their homes, and they would answer them almost constantly in English. And even back then, it bothered me. I'm like, man, be proud of it. Speak back in Spanish with her, with your mom. But these generational issues, they're real. They're real. And and you're gonna have peers that are either directly or indirectly pulling you in a different direction. And remember, as with sociology, right, is oftentimes the peer pressure, it's not always so overt, right? They're not going to say, dude, you speak Spanish with your parents, or something like that. That's not very realistic. But maybe they just kind of smile and grin and shake their head. Maybe it's just the slightest bit of some type of satire, some way of kind of laughing at them or whatever. It could take the slightest social cues, and especially at a young impressionable age, the young Latino or anybody for that matter, right? Portuguese, Persian, anything, could start feeling this sense of tension. Like, well, I don't want to continue to adhere to that part of my parents' culture, or at least I don't want to demonstrate it in front of others. So anyway, guys, that's it for today. I hope you guys feel okay on this material that I've gone over. Hope that I explained it sufficiently well. And then also, the second one that I did is due a week from today. So hopefully we're staying a little bit ahead of schedule. And I wish you guys well. Thank you for showing up at this, Yadira. Thank you, hon. At this stage in the semester, especially as I've been sick and different things that have happened, I apologize for that. I'm doubly proud of you for at this point, going beyond halfway through the semester, your continual participation in these Zooms. I really, really appreciate you. All right, so please know that, and you guys take care, okay, and have a good week. Okay, you guys take care, all of you. Thank you, Xavier.